everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are in the world. My name is Jake Damari, and I'm a digital strategist at Agency Oasis, and I'll be your moderator for today's webinar, Globalization in a Content World. First, let me introduce you to our speaker, Jason Fields. Jason Fields has been immersed in the constantly shifting world of digital since 1998 and into two-wheeled vehicles since he was born. He's a Senior Vice President of Strategy at Agency Oasis, where we provide our clients with consulting on digital strategy, content strategy, digital marketing measurement, ongoing optimization, and customer experience. Today, Jason's going to cover globalization in a content world, which details how to create a digital experience that truly mirrors all languages and cultures where your organization is currently or may want to be present. You can start asking questions at any time by using the chat on the right side of the webinar interface, or by tweeting at Shaping the Game in Agency Oasis with the hashtag #ContentGlobalization. Following this webinar, there will be time for questions, so please feel free to ask away. Also, we will send a recording of this webinar to everyone who registered. This is the next in a series of webinars that Jason and I are producing, where we discuss all facets of digital strategy. And I'll be the next speaker discussing digital transformation sometime in September, so we'll keep you posted on that day. Don't forget to register. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Mr. Jason Fields.
Well, hi, everybody. This is Jason Fields. Thank you for joining us today and finding some time. Give everybody a heads up. We've obviously timed this out. We think it's going to be probably about 40 minutes with a little bit of time for Q&A at the end, so everyone should get a few minutes back at the end of the hour. For those of us in the Pacific time zone, we'll be able to leave for lunch early. So thanks again for joining us. The agenda that we're going to hit on today is unintentionally shaped like a funnel here. We're going to talk for a few minutes just about why we're talking about this. We're going to go over a couple of opening notes and a couple of summary items. We're going to get into some working definitions around some of the key terminology in globalization and localization. Then we're going to talk about some strategy versus tactics, get into a couple of key considerations if you're attempting to get into this in your current organization. We'll go through a couple of examples, and we'll just have a couple of closing notes. So why are we talking about this? Well, over the past few years, the idea of English as being the primary content language globally has been steadily decreasing. In 2013, of the top 10 global websites, you'll notice here in these charts that English represented 21% of all of those websites and the content in those websites. And in 2014, that number dropped by 14%. But we're not limited to just websites. If you were to do an analysis of the top 10 downloads and revenue in iOS, you'd note that about 50% of the countries with the top 10 downloads in iOS are not English-speaking countries. And for the top 5 downloads and revenue in Google Play, 80% of the countries in the top 5 are not English-speaking. So this is both from a web standpoint and from an app standpoint, how people are engaging with brands and brand values. Moving over to e-commerce, there's some really interesting statistics that start telling us that the way that we're speaking to and communicating with our audiences and with our customers are influencing the way that they're actually purchasing with us. You know, in a survey that Common Sense Media did in 2014, they noted that almost 75% of global consumers prefer their native language when shopping online. That in and of itself wasn't a shocking number to me, right? I mean, I think anybody who has a native in their native language would prefer to consume content in their native language, so not earth-shattering. But when you move over to some of these other numbers, 55% only buy products from websites with information in their own language, or 56% saying that content in their own language is more important than the price. You start seeing how important having a globalization strategy and a localization strategy for your content and for your brand is going to be over time. And then we start looking at social, which is, you know, sort of one of the next pillars of digital content. You know, Facebook put together a study in 2014 where they noted that those brands and products that had local communities in addition to or instead of their global communities experienced about 2 times the growth rate and 50% higher engagement than those brands that only had global brand content on that platform. So you start seeing a real trend towards people expecting as part of their customer experience that localization and localized content is going to become part of the norm. That in those statistics in and of themselves, you know, they seem interesting, they're compelling, but when you have to pair them up against something, and I think the thing that we thought was really interesting to pair them up against was this idea of how many people globally are have access to the internet and are consuming content, through mobile, through web, through apps. The lighter shade of pinks that you see on the graphic that's in front of you here, the lighter the shade, the less internet use penetration that country has. So you can see sort of Western civilizations having sort of that higher, darker red, and then trailing off towards developing nations and emerging markets. And then you compare that against, from a global population standpoint, how many people are actually native English speakers. So you can see that although English as a unique language is behind only Chinese in terms of the total sort of percentage of internet users that speak that as a native language, if you compare that to the graphic that's on the right-hand side here, you'll notice that English represents almost 3 times the amount of content globally as is the percentage of native speakers that are internet users. So there's this disproportionate balance between the amount of content that's in English versus the number of people that are accessing it. And certainly English is the dominant language. We're not trying to bash English in any way. But what we have noticed is that when you have emerging markets that have yet to widely disperse internet access, but certainly as Moore's Law continues to be proven over time and technology gets cheaper, easier, and faster, we're going to start seeing countries like China, who currently have a 46.03% internet use penetration, we're going to see their access grow exponentially. So we've sort of already hit this tipping point with countries like the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, right? There's a very small percentage of people that still have yet to access the internet in these primary Western markets. But in the emerging markets and in third world developing markets, there's this massive opportunity. And yet the percentage of content that is being created and being targeted to these people is still relatively low. Even you see Arabic with a 2,500% growth year over year from 2011 to 2012 online is largely being driven from what we can tell by a single market, which is the United Arab Emirates, with a 93% market penetration. But still a massive opportunity when you look at the rest of Arabic-speaking nations with really low internet use penetration numbers. So that's why we're talking about it, because we think there's a massive opportunity to start coming up with strategies, tactics, and approaches that are going to enable brands, regardless of your B2B or your B2C, to start communicating your brand value, your opportunity, and what you can provide out to people who aren't part of that sort of largely English, Western, civilized community. We're going to go over a few terms here in just a minute. I want to note here that these terms have different meanings for different people. If you've ever gotten into a religious debate with somebody over the meaning of agile with a capital A versus agile with a lowercase a, you'll sort of understand this. The terms that we're going to be talking about need to be common between either you and your agency, or if you're an agency person, between you and your client, or if you're doing this all in-house, between departments, because people can start assuming different things with these terms. One of the last things to note here is that these terms originated from software development and not from marketing and communication, and that'll be evident pretty quickly as we go through them. So we're sort of adding these on or hamstringing these into our current marketing practices over the past 5 or 10 years, but they originally started out in software and hardware development. And because they started out in software and hardware development, what we notice is that there's a lot of different aspects to these terms and what they can mean, specifically between different departments or different organizations. So some working definitions. Internationalization, you'll notice we separated it out here with hyphens. There are 18 letters between the letter I and the letter N. Only a developer would think this way. So the acronym actually is I-18N. If you ever do any research or you're looking at any software, hardware development specs, and you see this term I-18N, it means they've taken internationalization into consideration with their software development. Key thing to note is that internationalization does not equal globalization. That'll become very apparent here in just a moment. Globalization, you may notice, has 11 letters between G and N. That's actually a formal abbreviation as well. They call it G11N. And then we have localization, which is a term that's going to be very important to this conversation. 10 letters between L and N. And you'll notice that we use a capital L here. That is on purpose. The reason being is that a lowercase l looks a lot like an I. Since we already have I-18N, we are going to use an uppercase L. This difference between localization and translation is pretty important because I think that a lot of, especially sort of like newer marketers, people that don't have a lot of experience in this area, think that translation actually just automatically means that you've localized your content, and that's not the case, and we'll talk about why here in a second. And then translation with 9 letters between T and N, well, it actually doesn't have this abbreviation, and I can't exactly tell you why, but it doesn't. So the actual definitions of these things. Internationalization is very specific, and it hasn't evolved outside of software and hardware development. Internationalization actually means that the software, the hardware that you're using has the capability built into its coding language to be able to be managed and accepted through different geographies and different cultures and different sort of native speaking languages. So it's a coding technique. Whereas globalization is really around the brand side of things. Globalization is the idea of taking your product, your service, and being able to tweak it or nuance it just enough so that it has a slightly different meaning in some markets than it may have in some. As sort of a quick for example here, you can think of Coca-Cola, who does a really great job, obviously, of packaging their product in different ways across the globe. Whereas Coca-Cola looks one way here in the Americas, when I go down to Mexico, I get Coca-Cola bottles, right? So they're very sensitive to. It's got a slightly different design. It's actually different recipes. They've got a nuance. They have a globalization strategy around their product globally. Translation is probably the term that everyone has the most level of comfort with, because translation literally means transcribing a word from one language to another. So hello to hola. And this is the most common approach. It's sort of the de facto strategy a lot of people associate with globalization. And then the last is localization, and this is really where the concept of globalization and content in a globalization strategy really comes in. Because localization is the process of taking the nuance of culture and geography and standards of a particular area of the world or a particular set of a community and focusing your content, your communication, your value to them specifically. So obviously within the word localization is the idea of a locale. Locale it's a concept, it's not a specific, right? So locales can be anything you want. Locales can be Spain, or they can be Madrid, or they could be a neighborhood in Madrid, right? It could be California, or it could be Santa Monica, or it could be downtown Santa Monica. So the locale becomes this interesting concept that can be used and defined per organization to hit the right level of complexity or appropriateness of how you want to target your content out to different markets. Just a quick screen grabbing all of them and putting them together, you can see that they all do have very specific and different meanings. So what we thought was we would take a few minutes and talk about the different approaches that you can use these ideas with. For us, the real important differences is that we want to understand how things can be used as a strategy versus a tactic. And so these four things fall sort of 50-50% between the two. For us, localization requires a strategy, and globalization requires a strategy, right? It requires a larger plan of how you're going to unroll the approach to achieve both of those things and the business objectives that those ideas are going to communicate with them. Versus translation and internationalization become actually tactics of those strategies, right? Translation, it doesn't require a strategy in and of itself. It requires action. It's a tactic, as is internationalization. The other reason that we think that these things have a strategic and a tactical relationship is because they have interdependencies on one another. When you combine translation, globalization, and internationalization, you can actually achieve localization. But if you take any one of those three things away, it's very, very difficult to achieve that localized content, that targeted message. On the flip side, if you don't have internationalization, you can't actually achieve translation, localization, or globalization, because internationalization is that underpinning that allows all three of those things to actually come to life. So it seems like internationalization is pretty important. And you're absolutely right. If anybody on the line recognizes this Chief Martech technology landscape, which is obviously too small to recognize any of the logos, the nice thing about all of these platforms is that internationalization is generally solved simply by purchasing the technology themselves. most technology software, marketing technology software, is going to solve for the internationalization problem so that marketers can focus on the other things that they're more adept at solving, right? The globalization challenge, the translation challenge, and the localization challenge. So before we get into considerations, and somebody on our team actually tweeted out earlier about a rant that I would have about flags, and I'll keep it pretty short, but I think all of us are pretty familiar with the way flags have been used in the past. And in the early ages of the internet, back when we were moving away from IRC chat rooms into actual websites, the flag became this really interesting user experience element that people generally put on the upper right-hand side of their page, and you could click on a flag and it would change the language, and it was pretty impressive at the time. There's a lot of brands that are still relying on that visual experience to actually trigger translated content. And I think that given the evolution that we have around customer experience and the way that we're engaging with our clientele and our prospective clients, that the idea of a flag has really become overused and overvalued. The idea that everyone in America is going to speak English is obviously no longer the case. And brands that take that sort of consideration, the idea of geography and language together, meaning something that's more local and sort of pursuant and sensitive to an individual user, I think are going to get a lot farther. So, and we'll end my rant there. So, moving on to implementation considerations. There's a number of different layers that are going to be of a marketing strategy, a marketing plan, and organizational efficiency that are going to be influenced by which one of these approaches we're going to talk about. And they're organized here with some pretty standard departments or skill sets. From a planning standpoint, there's a lot of things that a globalization and localization strategy are going to require planning around. If you're managing content on any channel in just one language, the governance model is relatively simple, even in a complex organization. But when you start multiplying that out in multiple languages or multiple locales, governance becomes a lot more complex, as does your offline processes, permissions within the marketing software about how people can access and modify your content. Interestingly enough, something that gets overlooked quite a bit is the idea of time zone impact, the idea of publishing, when it should be published. Sometimes hardware can get into the mix because you have hardware located in different spaces of the globe. And so uptime or access to those servers, migrations, things of that nature can come into play quite a bit. Also around regional and country value. Cultural variance is a pretty obvious one. Content strategy, whereas you might have a content strategy for your primary sort of maybe American-driven and owned headquarters or brand core, it may need to change a little bit when you start moving into global locales, as will the social strategy. There's also an opportunity to take into effect how maybe the goals, the conversions, the KPIs, and measurement are going to change a little bit differently. And of course, URL structure as well. With project management sort of related to a lot of those things, dedicated resource, roles and responsibility, communication plans. With user experience, this is a really interesting one because a lot of brands, and we'll talk about this in an example that we'll show here in a minute, but a lot of brands can get away with just having one user experience but changing the content itself. Some brands can't get away with that. So brand nuance, sensitive imagery, directionality, some languages are up and down, some languages are left to right, right to left. Shared structure versus unique structure. These are some really interesting things that you want to consider when you're putting together a strategy around the subject. Development around scalability, versioning, ISO code support, depending on certain countries, can become a really important element to consider as well. Again, URL structure, sort of how things are organized on a back end of a management system. Defensive coding, and what we mean by that is sort of having elegant failure, so that if something works really well in one country and you try to replicate it in another, but it's not working well there from a browser support standpoint or whatnot, that it fails elegantly and doesn't erode the user experience and brand affinity. And then, of course, directionality as well. And then the last piece, you know, the piece that most people are willing to sacrifice at the beginning of the project because they want to save scope or they want to save budget or timeline, is that quality assurance element. And when you start putting out different content in different languages and different locales, that quality assurance piece absolutely should never really be deleted, in my personal opinion, but it absolutely is critical to consider when you start rolling out a global approach, because you need to start paying attention to how the language, the content, the message is going to be validated. So native speakers, cultural nuance, and then the testing plans themselves become a lot more complex. So let's look at a couple of examples of how this is currently being handled out there in the marketplace. This is a one message, one language, or what some people might say, don't know, don't care. This is what a lot of brands, specifically brands that are just starting out with global presence, are going to want to execute against. This is the idea of just having one message. It's in one language. We serve the same message in the same language to everybody on the globe. Then we move over to sort of the next level of complexity, which is what a lot of brands choose to adopt as a first step because it is the most simplistic, generally the easiest to execute, which is the idea of having one website with multiple languages, and each of those languages can either be auto-selected through sort of technology sniffing or listening based on what who the country is, where they're coming from, or the user can auto-select, self-select where they want to go. But essentially, it's not nuanced at all for any of these different countries. It is going to be the exact same content. It's just going to be translated from its first language into its second language. Then we get into sort of the more complex models. This is localization by region and language. So this is grouping countries together into a region. This is a pretty standard region groupings. We've got North America, South America, Africa, Asia, Western Europe, Eastern Europe, etc. And this is the idea of, instead of trying to worry about or concern ourselves with every single language in every single region, you can actually start polling or doing some research around what your audience speaks, and you can then focus in on maybe the top 3, top 5 languages that are specific to that region, and then start nuancing the content for them in that language, right? So if I'm targeting somebody in Western Europe with American English versus UK English, right, there's some small nuanced stuff, right? We use Z's instead of S's, that sort of stuff. But think about it this way. If I was trying to sell a can of Coca-Cola to somebody, an American speaker in French, an American expatriate, would I sell it differently to them than I would a French person who is a native speaker and born and raised in Paris? So there's that idea of getting down to a level of clarity that you can actually start changing the message. The next layer, the next level is sort of the most complex, and this is localization with country and culture. So this is specifically going after individual countries, and we did a lot of research around this. There's actually not a single brand that we could find that has every country globally represented with different web content, social content, search content, etc. But it's certainly an opportunity, and the technology that's out there in the market today could support it if it ever was chosen to. But the idea here is very simple, or very similar to the regional concept, except it's narrowing itself down on a country specifically, which may decrease the amount of translation or localized content you need, because countries tend to have smaller subsets of languages than entire regions do. So let's look at a couple of examples. Focusing in on the web channel tends to be the most popular around this subject. We looked at McDonald's. So here's 4 screen grabs: Guatemala, Canada, Italy, and China. You can see that they have done something different with each one of these countries, not only by translating their content into the native language of that country, or what you might assume to be the native language of that country, but they've also gone through and done some user experience changes. So you notice that in China, with China, red's a very strong color. They've gone ahead and kept their native McDonald's red. They're using it in the background. They're using it in the imagery. Some of the characters are that yellow sort of getting into the red, with white as that stark contrast, versus Italy, where red is less used in marketing and advertising, right? So they've gone with a softer green. They've actually adjusted their logo for that, so they're localizing their brand association in that country. Versus Canada looks a lot more similar to what we might be experienced and used to here in the United States. And then you look over to Guatemala, which is much more sparse, right? There's no heavy background. There's no heavy imagery. Well, one of the reasons that we think that is the case is because Guatemala is still on the uptick in terms of speed and access to the internet. So they're actually, seems to be, they're conscious of decreasing the total size of imagery and content in that Guatemalan website so that people who have slower connection speeds can actually still access the content with a great deal of efficiency, which we think is a really interesting choice. And then we look at an example of a global brand with regionalization. And we looked at Ford for this example. And you'll notice here that the 2 examples on the left-hand side of the page share the same general user experience and content layout. And the examples on the right-hand side of the page, still Ford, also share the same general layout user experience. So they've identified here, even though they're using different domains, which you can see on the bottom of the screen as well, even though they're using different domains, they have decided that it's totally appropriate for them to use the same general layout of content. And instead of changing the user experience on the whole, they're going to focus in on localizing the marketing content specifically. So they're regionalizing their content or by country for regions. So you can see that in Ethiopia, they're focusing on sort of that smaller SUV market, probably a lower price point. In Argentina, they've gone with more of a traditional Ford performance Mustang feel. In China, the larger sort of Western hyper-focused large SUV. And in New Zealand, for, I'm sure market research sussed it out, but for whatever reason, they're focusing on sort of a concept car, really high-performance vehicle. But still sharing what it appears to be the same technology, the same design, the same user experience, and really leveraging that across all of their sites. And then we look at an example like Harley-Davidson, which is a global brand, has a foreign presence, but their brand is so tied to their geography and to their country identification that they actually are, I won't say it's not suffering, they're actually taking advantage of that and applying it to the same, literally the same messaging and literally the same calls to action, the same user experience with simply translated content across their different sites. So you look at Algeria isn't translated, they're offering Algerians English as a language. In Canada, they've chosen French. In the United Arab Emirates, I'm assuming probably around affluence, they've also decided that English could be used. And in those three countries, they're using the same image, they're using the same tagline. I actually translated the Canadian French one. It says the exact same thing in French that the English version says. And then in Brazil, one of those sliders actually toggles over, but they've chosen to use just a slightly more esoteric approach to communicating the brand value. But this is sort of an anomaly, right? Not all brands have this ability to be all things to all people, but Harley, because they're Harley, because if you buy a Harley in Brazil or you buy a Harley in America, you're probably buying it for the same reason. You love motorcycles, you love loud motorcycles. You don't need to shift that entire brand approach and brand value over. So a really interesting difference between these different brands. Globalization also has quite a few SEO and structural considerations, so we thought it would be interesting to look how Harley-Davidson versus McDonald's approaches this. Again, we noted that Harley-Davidson really hyper-focused on American culture, sort of a pillar of that here. They opted to just have a single .com and manage all of their locales and all of their translations through directories. So you see the same domain here on the left-hand side of the page, simply using the slash as a directory inference, English being represented by EN and then an underscore, and the second two letters in capitals are the countries. So between the language and the country association, it's actually pulling from a different repository of content. Versus McDonald's thought it appears they think that it's very important for them to actually own some native domains to specific countries. So Japan, although they didn't buy a Fiji domain, they worked Fiji into a domain. Same with Egypt. They have a Canadian domain, and they actually bought a .com Canadian domain as well. So you can see that they decided, rather than running everything off of a single unified URL, they've done different URLs. And they probably chose to do this, we're guessing, because they don't have the same content. You know, they've globalized their product, right? It's a Big Mac in America. It's Le Big Mac in France. So they don't believe that they're going to have to run into a lot of duplication issues with their content, so they can really focus on getting those messages specific to the region, to the country, and allow SEO to work and propagate through all of the domains in a very positive way. So one of the questions that we get with our clients that we talk about this is like, where should we start? And it seems pretty high level, and it is, but it's where we should be focusing. And it's this idea of two key questions around a brand. And the idea is understanding if the brand has a single persona or a uniform persona or a diverse persona that means different things to different people, right? And that's that idea of, Harley-Davidson versus Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola means different things to different people. They have different recipes for different countries versus Harley-Davidson can be itself all the time. So once you answer that question and you can figure that out, it actually starts easing the strategy decisions that you need to move towards. The next question is, how can the brand balance catering to the diversity of markets with the desire for consistent application of the brand or corporate persona? So it's that idea, if we actually do have a globalization approach for our products or for our services, we don't want to stray too far away from it from a user experience standpoint, from a content standpoint, so that people don't recognize us, but we do need to diversify ourselves just enough so that we're actually catering to the nuance of different locales, different people, and different cultures. Once you understand both of those things, it starts becoming really important to start speccing out and start planning out where these operational impacts are going to be, because this is a different way of operating a business, right? Marketing is starting to very quickly become the owner of customer experience, very quickly becoming the owner of all communications with customers, not just about trying to put people into the sales funnel, but about continuing that relationship well after they've already purchased something or engaged with us. And so to that effect, the operational impacts become pretty clear. The product and services globalization is going to start being influenced by cultural and product services design. It's going to start necessitating different marketing language and possibly a different way of delivering things. Content generation with translation, with nuance, its value prop, its imagery, and its creation is going to become different region by region or country by country, so that you're actually showing a super appropriate message and value to people in a different part of the world than you would maybe where you first started. Active governance, again, becomes very important and something that should be planned for in advance, because the last thing you want to do is unleash a globalization or a localization strategy, get a bunch of content written, produced, published, and then not know how to repeat that month over month, quarter over quarter. So having those rules in place and processes in place become very important. Resourcing, hopefully you're not doing it all from headquarters. Hopefully you have local markets that have resources that are going to support you. So having those global relationships, understanding a single approval process versus a multi-level approval process around content and publishing, having access to native speakers so that you can ensure that your content isn't just being translated, but it's being localized. And then lastly, around customer experience, and that's just consistency of message market, by country, and by speaker, so that all the way through that customer experience funnel and through that customer journey map, people are having the same experience in their own language with their own locale consistently, rather than just being dropped and picked up wherever it was most convenient for your organization to have the initial impact. So what can companies do? It's pretty simple, really, and it has less to do with technology, and it has more to do with sort of internal behavior and organizational structure, and it's around education, communication, and empathy. Around education, really just training local staff in web usability. You probably have a headquarters marketing team that's very well adept and very strong, understanding of what the goals of the organization are. When you start unrolling that globally, you're going to get more power and more efficiency if you're able to translate those and communicate those out to them so that they can start onboarding that on their own, so you're not constantly in a state of explaining things. That said, communicating out the marketing rationale is extraordinarily important. People that operate in different local offices globally or nationally can sometimes not totally be understanding. They weren't totally communicated with as to the rationales why decisions were made. It's probably true across more than just this subject matter, to be quite honest, but specifically when it comes to globalization and localization, being able to express that rationale, that intent that you had from a corporate model into a local market becomes really important for them to get on board with the plan. And then the last is just that around empathy. You can imagine if you yourself were in a smaller market and you were getting dictated down to from corporate, it may feel like the creativity is being quashed or your voices weren't being heard. But in fact, that local office and the local resources around globalization and localization that you have a lot to offer you and can actually start influencing your own decisions at a corporate marketing level, and maybe even give you some insights faster and cheaper than you would have if you weren't involving them in the conversation. So those are our closing remarks around some of the next steps. I want to thank everybody for their time. I think with any luck, Jake may have collected a couple of questions from the audience. I'd be happy to do my best to answer them if we can.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Jason. A few questions here. First, among the examples that you shared, McDonald's, Ford, and Harley-Davidson, what do you believe is the best approach?
Fair question. The truth is that I don't think that there is a best approach. I think every brand needs to go through this process. It's not cookie cutter and it's not templatized for a reason, and it never should be. Harley gets to take advantage of their brand recognition, as does McDonald's, and they're just doing it in different ways, but they're doing it in ways that are maximizing profit, revenue, and their customer experience.
Interesting. You mentioned the full customer experience. Is it a bad idea for organizations to translate and localize their marketing if their products are not internationalized?
No, I don't. I'm sure that there's probably instances where it could be, but as a general rule of thumb, I wouldn't think so. Even if a product or service is going to have the same meaning to everyone, I think it shows a level of respect and admiration to the markets that are purchasing your product or service, that you're taking the time to communicate with them in a way that's easier for them to adopt and comprehend.
Okay. What are the biggest obstacles to globalization?
In my experience to date, I think it's probably the idea that globalization and localization is this idea that I think a lot of marketers are passionate about within their marketing department. And sometimes it becomes very difficult to prove that ROI and the appropriate brand affinity value for going through that process with senior executives that have the ability to make it a mandate versus just an idea. So usually it's that sort of senior advocate.
Executive vision. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
What are the best practices to develop a website that is optimized for globalization from the start?
Great question. I think that more than anything, it's having the awareness that you need to have this strategy moving forward as part of that foundation. There's a lot of strategies around web channel and content marketing that need to be decided, and I think that globalization and localization gets left off because it appears to be too complex. The power that you get as a marketing team or as an agency working with a brand's marketing team, having a specific localization strategy or understanding that it's just not going to come yet, but it's going to come someday, gives you a lot of empowerment to make really interesting scalability choices at the technology level, but also starts preparing mentally and perhaps even strategically your human resources that it's going to come. And you'd be surprised what that level of awareness and exposure does for human resources in terms of the decisions they make around tactical issues.
All right. One more question. What can I do if my organization didn't plan for globalization during our last redesign, but it is now becoming necessary for us to sort out?
I think that the first thing you want to do is probably just a quick marketing technology audit. There's a lot of technologies that are employed that don't have the capability of even dealing with globalization, so you can get sort of a litmus test or a temperature real quick as the complexity of the issue by doing that sort of quick technology analysis. I think also probably just some internal interviews with key decision makers to find out what the not only aptitude but sort of desire or appetite for work itself is going to be, because there are going to be different levels of effort that are required depending on the technology stack, depending on the existing user experience. Sometimes you don't need to do the full overhaul. Sometimes it's more about content and going through that exercise, but leaving the user experience relatively untouched. Other times it needs to be a complete overhaul. So really it's just doing that upfront work to get a temperature on the total level of effort. And usually your agency can help you do that relatively quickly. Or maybe you have internal IT resources and marketing resources that can help you do that, and then it becomes a much easier conversation with people that have the ability to write checks or make those decisions with you.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Jason, and thank you to everyone on the call who joined us today. You can check us out for more of our thinking at shapingthega.me, that's our blog, or agencyoasis.com. You can also catch up with us on Twitter at agencyoasis. @InteractiveJJ, and @JakeDamari. Before we go, I'd like to just give a special thanks to our friends at Globalization Partners International. GPI provides translation, globalization, localization, and internationalization for website, software, and documentation. They have actually provided us with translation services in the past as a partner, and they have our recommendation. So thank you, and have a great day.